A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today at the joint roundtable titled Humanitarianism, Development Assistance, Early Warning and Political Violence in South Asia in a Post-Liberal International Order. This roundtable is jointly organized by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore and the Université di Napoli L'Orientale, Italy. My name is Divyani Chaturvedi and I'm a research analyst at ISAS, and I will be your MC for today's event. Today's roundtable explores how the unraveling of the liberal international order is reshaping humanitarian action and early warning systems. It interrogates the erosion of neutrality, the increasing politicization of aid, and the limits of predictive tools that often fail to trigger effective responses. The participants today will also consider emerging post-liberal humanitarian models, authoritarian, religious, nationalist, or solidaristic, and reflect on the broader implications for South Asia and the global South amid funding cuts, shrinking humanitarian space, and growing uncertainty. Today's session will also be live streamed on ISAS and its Facebook page. So today we're delighted to have with us the following speakers: Mr. Andrea Novellis, postdoctoral researcher at the University of Naples, L'Orientale, Italy. I already apologize in case I mispronounce somebody's name. Please correct me. Mr. Federico Macchiocchia from the Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies, Pisa, and School of International Studies, University of Trento, Italy. We have with us Dr. Zahid Shahab Ahmad, Honorary Doctoral Fellow at the Deakin Institute of Citizenship and Globalization under the Deakin University, Australia. And he's also a non-resident fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies here with us. We also have with us Dr. Asif M. Shahan, who is a professor at the Department of Development Studies at the University of Dhaka in Bangladesh and a senior research fellow at the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development. We also have with us Dr. Rajni Gamge, research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at NUS. And today's session will be chaired by Dr. Ruth Hanau Santini, who is an associate professor at the University of Naples, Italy. To commence the session, I would like to invite Dr. Rajni Gamge, research fellow here at ISAS, to deliver the welcoming remarks. I now hand over the session to Dr. Rajni and Dr. Santini. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Devyani, and hello, everyone. On behalf of ISAS, welcome to this joint webinar, which I think is a very timely webinar, some of the topics that we'll be discussing. And my introductory remarks will be very brief, also because I'll be speaking later in this panel. So really, I just wanted to say that this webinar, we can think of it as an exercise of reflecting on some of the key political developments that are currently unfolding globally, particularly this question of the resilience and the relevance of institutions in responding to humanitarian and development needs. And especially as we are witnessing this accelerated dismantling of institutions at the international level, we can also think of this at the domestic level as well. And perhaps more strikingly, of the dismantling or the taking back of norms and discourses that once legitimized the liberal international order and its dominance. So in particular, we hope to examine how these global shifts are shaping the environment in which political violence unfolds in South Asia, and what really this political violence means, what forms it takes, and how the capacity of the states and institutions and really broader society to respond to these dynamics are. So with that, I think I'll end my introductory remarks and hand over to Professor Santini to chair the session. And I look forward to an engaging discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajni, and thanks everyone at the center, at ISAS, and I'm very happy to welcome all the speakers that have accepted our invitation. I'm very happy also for this first joint event that we managed to set up and organize over the past few months. It's been a bumpy road, and I'm very happy about the final kind of delivery and the shape it's taking. So maybe just a couple of words on introducing this topic within a broader research agenda that we carried out at Orientale for the past couple of years. This webinar is also part of a research project that I led together with a group of economists and linguists at Orientale on the analysis of the pitfalls and the promises of political risks analysis. So we looked at, in particular, how, and the presentation by Federico Maciocia will shed light on what I'm about to say, the main early warning systems across international organizations, the UN in particular, but also the European Union, have developed over the past couple of decades, the state of the art of these systems, the rationale, their shortcomings, their limits, and basically the way ahead. This research project was aimed at trying to understand how how these systems, early warning systems in particular, which mix both a qualitative and a quantitative approach in their various shapes, have helped to counter, predict, and by predicting, can respond in a more effective manner to the main humanitarian crises that we are looking at in the world today. So the case studies that we selected for this webinar mostly revolve around Asia, of course, for various reasons. And I'm also glad because it's some of these case studies are case studies that are relatively new to us. And I'm thinking about Bangladesh and Pakistan. At least they were not part of our original research design at Orientale. We focus mostly on Sri Lanka, but also Israel and Palestine on October 7th. And initially, we were meant to look also at a couple of cases in the Central Sahel countries. But I'm really keen to see how the different presentations will provide a picture of not only specifically the technicalities of these early warning systems, but how these elements created by international organizations, but also local organizations and regional organizations are evolving within a much broader landscape of already an emerging post-liberal international order where liberal humanitarianism is being impacted and humanitarian organizations are paying a huge price and also possibly the predictive tools that have been utilized so far in the prediction of humanitarian crisis. So without further ado, I would like again to thank all the participants. I'm very glad about this event. I'm happy about all the speakers that will follow. And we are going to start with Andrea Novellis, who's postdoc researcher at Orientale, who has been working in the past year or so on Sri Lanka, both from the economic crisis vantage point and the all linkages around the economic crisis, but also the nature of early warning vis-a-vis the crisis in Sri Lanka. So each speaker will have between 10 and 12 minutes, we said, so that it's possible also to have enough room for Q&A at the end. So after Andrea will leave the floor to Federico, who just finished his degree at Orientale and is now proceeding with his studies between Pisa and Trento, who will provide a literature review on early warning systems for conflict, which I think will be a very useful kind of setting the stage for the rest of the discussion, which will focus much more on specific case studies such as Pakistan, Bangladesh, and then again with you, Rajni, Sri Lanka. So thanks everyone, and Andrea, please, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Ruth. So I will share my screen. I will try to share the presentation. Right. Could you please confirm that you can see this?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so this is, as Ruth mentioned, one of the case studies from our bigger research project. And I was interested in the Sri Lankan case because, so as we all know, in 2022, Sri Lanka was under a very severe economic crisis. This led to mass protests and the fall of the government, and the economic crisis led also to a food crisis. So then and even now the country hasn't yet recovered from it. So there are high levels of poverty, and at the time there were also high levels of food insecurity. So in this situation, my research puzzle was, in a sense, quite evident for me, because the crisis exploded in 2022, but actually started unfolding at least from 2021 and earlier. And in 2021, the previous government decided to ban fertilizers and agrochemicals, and this led in the following months to this food crisis. In 2021, also local experts issued warnings about the risks of this fertilizer ban. So the question is, why did the international early warning and early action systems fail to generate a coherent actionable warning for a crisis that was actually developing in plain sight? So how did they fail to see this crisis coming in? Usually when we talk about the action of international organizations when it comes to humanitarian reaction, humanitarian intervention, we discuss why this organization failed. We look at the warning response gap. So usually the problem is either the United Nations agencies or other organizations had the knowledge, but they couldn't act, or they didn't have enough data, and so they didn't see crisis coming. Instead, in this paper, by looking at Sri Lanka, I introduced the concept of institutional knowledge filters. So basically, I argue that each organization was looking at reality through certain sectoral rationalities and technologies of knowing, and this obscured the cross-domain risks that was unfolding in Sri Lanka. So in this way, I'm not looking at the will of the organizations, the capacity of the organizations. I'm not looking at whether the state object of the crisis was willing to receive help, but rather I'm looking at the epistemic knowledge productions of the international organizations themselves. And I put this in the context of polycrisis because I consider the crisis in Sri Lanka as a polycrisis. Polycrisis is a relatively new term now, actually very fashionable to use, but basically the causal entanglement across multiple systems where the risk exceeds the sum of the individual crisis happening. So, and polycrisis unfolds like a domino effect, where and in Sri Lanka, basically, I say it's a polycrisis because basically it was a domino effect, because there was an agricultural policy shock, there was a food and a foreign currency shock, there was a macroeconomic collapse, there was a humanitarian crisis, and a breakdown of the political system. And all these crises were connected. So as I said, I look at how the international organizations saw the crisis and how they reacted to the crisis per governmentality lens. So I looked at how they think that and how they operationalize their knowledge. And I identified three mechanisms that basically didn't allow them to see the crisis. These three mechanisms are cognitive partitioning, technocratic depoliticization, and procedural inertia. And we will see this mechanism through the case study. This is a qualitative study. I used elite interviews with United Nations Sri Lanka officials, local organizations. I used the primary documents, mostly from the European Union World Food Programme, FAO, and I triangulate all the data. So, I mean, I think we don't need to go through the crisis chronology again, but basically started unfolding since 2019 when there was the first signs of a crisis because of the Eastern bombing attacks. There was COVID, and all of this put a huge stress on the country's finances. But the interesting thing for me was the main decision that kind of escalated everything was the ban on chemical fertilizers in April 2021, and this is the starting point of the first phase. So in here, this is important. So in 2021, the government banned fertilizers, and several local organizations actually signaled that this was a potential trigger for a crisis. So, for example, farmer surveys anticipated harvest loss, local NGOs also said that this was going to lead to disruption. And actually projections, so there were projections for local organizations that basically anticipated huge diminishing yields in especially public cultivation, tea cultivations. So there were cross-domain predictions of the impending crisis. But at the same time, I go back here, at the same time, the different international organizations were looking at events in a different way. So for example, and here we're talking about filters, because the European Union, which has basically a complex system for early warning and eventually early action in different international scenarios. The European Union was looking at Sri Lanka through the lenses of political security rationality. So it was prioritizing conflict prevention, human rights, but it wasn't looking at the possible outcomes of economic shocks and the humanitarian outcomes of economic shocks. So during 2021, internal meetings of European Union were only looking at those things, and in general, the economic problems were not seen in as a possible triggers of humanitarian or political crisis. At the same time, the United Nations agencies like the World Food Programme (FAO) were assuming normal input conditions. The reports issued were just projections based on past agricultural production. So actually, they projected above average harvest of 2021. And only by the end of 2021, they were talking about rising food prices, but there was no early warning issue. And that's because basically FAO didn't, without government input, they didn't have any basically reason to get into the field, and they had no anticipatory framework in action. The only international organization that issued a warning was the international IMF. But of course, the IMF did not intervene because IMF can only intervene with the government approval. So the only, and the IMF was acting to the macroeconomic rationality, which was actually, so in that period was the only way to look at the Sri Lankan unfolding crisis, so through macroeconomic lines. In phase 2 of the crisis, so after the ban was enacted, fertilizer ban was enacted, inflation was increasing, we see lagging indicators from all the international organizations that they examined. So European Union was still acting according like the normal schedule. The European Union was acting for normal schedule, and but all the tools basically used for international for interacting with other states, all their tools were just doing basically routine analysis of the situation. At the same time, also, for example, World Food Programme was slowly acknowledging the fertilizer shock and increasing prices, but they, at the same time, they were not drafting any anticipatory action plan. What we see instead is a reactive mobilization. So only after the crisis unfolded, so only after there were mass protests, the Raggalaya protests, we see that the European Union issued formal statements urging for stepped up efforts. That was in mid-2022. We see the United Nations World Food Programme launched an emergency response. And we see that the IMF and the program negotiations with the new government. So basically all the emergency, this was a reactive mobilization though, because all this happened only after the crisis fully unfolded and after 2 years of escalating crisis. So in the paper, I argue that this is a failure is rooted in the epistemic design of the early warning and early action systems, because there was no data scarcity, and in this case political will was relevant, but to in order for international organizations to actually collect data and issue early warning, there was no need for local Sri Lankan government intervention. And at the same time, the post-mortem analysis of the intervention, for example, by the European Union talks about a success in the case of Sri Lanka, because they actually followed all their internal procedures correctly, even though it took them basically more than 2 years to actually get into action with the emergency response. And so, in a sense, all the internal mechanisms internal to the international organizations obscured the cascade effects that was unfolding during the 2021-2022 period. So in a sense, in the Sri Lankan case, we have an institutional failure to see the events, but not a refusal to act, because actually then the action happened in late 2022. So this is the Sri Lankan case, in a sense, has a different policy implication, because on the one hand, we see that coordination between the different agencies is of course necessary but insufficient, because coordination did happen, but in late 2022 when the crisis already unfolded. And also we see that it's important to integrate local knowledge into the formal assessment frameworks of the international organizations, because as we see in Sri Lanka, local knowledge already ring the warning bell in 2021. And in a sense, so there is a need to redesign the indicators used for early warning to capture the multi-domain risk before the crisis thresholds appear evident. So 13 minutes, so I would say that I can conclude here, and I'm aware that there is a lot still to say, and I hope I can keep discussing this in the Q&A. Thank you for now.
Thank you, Andrea, so much. I think it was very informative, and I think maybe in the Q&A it would be interesting to go back to the kind of institutional aspect of the epistemic design and what it means to rethink these epistemic designs of early warning systems, maybe also in the takeaway session. If Rajni doesn't have any comments or questions, I will leave the floor to the next presenter, Federico, whom I don't see in video, but I know he's online.
Yeah, I'm here. So
Okay, great. Now we see you. Perfect.
I have to share the screen. Let's share. Okay, do you see the screen on the? Okay, then good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here at the National University of Singapore, representing my former University of Naples, L'Orientale. I would like to thank the Institute of South Asian Studies and Dr. Rajni for inviting us to this important roundtable on humanitarianism and political violence in a post-liberal international order. Then, in a world where climate shocks, political instability, and social unrest often reinforce one another, the ability to anticipate crises before they erupt has become essential, basically. In fact, this research focuses on early warning systems for conflict, exploring how these predictive models are designed, how effective they are, and how international organizations actually use them. That's the table of contents, so I will try to do my best because the research project is huge, and I have basically to give you a literature review of this kind of topic. And yes, over the past few decades, overlapping global crises have exposed the limits of reactive governance, basically. And in this scenario, early warning systems have emerged as a strategic instruments for identifying early signs of political, social, or humanitarian instability that could lead to a potential violence. That's important. These systems collect and interpret large amounts of data to detect risk factors and provide timely alerts to governments, to NGOs and international institutions, so that preventive measures can be taken before the escalation, basically. And historically, if you want to do an historical framework, early warning system relied on qualitative analysis, basically the judgment of experts, diplomatic reporting, and the contextual interpretation. However, with the rise of data science and artificial intelligence, we have witnessed a shift toward quantitative models capable of forecasting conflict through statistical and machine learning approaches. Despite these advances, significant challenges remain, including the transparency and the accessibility of data, the lack of institutional coordination, and the difficulty of translating early warning system into preventive actions. But we will see that later. My research has two main goals. First of all, we have tried to analyze and compare the main early warning systems for conflict. There are a lot. There are 11, and so it will require a lot of time for me to explain all the early warning system for you. And but I have done a summary of table that I can share after in the Q&A. And basically, we have found a lot of early warning systems, such as Global Conflict Risk Index, Continental Early Warning System, Violence Early Warning System, and we will see that later, assessing their methodologies, predictive accuracy, and accessibility. And the second goals, that is the experimental goals of this kind of research, is to evaluate how international organizations and academic literature actually use these systems in decision-making progress. Obviously, when we talk about early warning systems, we must say before the main bias, the main limits of this one, because it's very important to understand the early warning system methodology. And we must consider both methodological and operational dimensions. On the methodological side, many studies on early warning systems still lack transparency. Their models, codes, and datasets are often not publicly available, which prevents replication and comparison across systems. And that's a very huge limit. The limits scientific reliability and makes it extremely difficult to validate predictive accuracy. And in short, without shared and verifiable data, we cannot truly measure which system works best. And at the operational level, instead, the problems become it becomes very structural, more structural. There is often a lack of coordination among the political institutions. In fact, early warning systems are not only technical tools, but also a political instruments operating in environments where institutional cooperation and trust are limited. Overcoming these biases requires not only requires a better algorithm, but stronger governance and genuine information sharing among the international institution, international organization in this context. And this study followed a three-phase methodology. First, a systematic literature review to map all major systems and their characteristics, following the primary paper, the most important paper made by Rod, Gass, and Egre, that is called a review and comparison of early warning system for conflict. Secondly, we have tried to analyzing the context with a systematic use of literature for the early warning system using Scopus or JSTOR. And third, the most important, so we begin to talk about early warning systems, is a comparative assessment based on 5 factors. First of all, we have tried to find data sources. Second, transparency and accessibility. Third, analytical methods. 4, evaluation metrics. And 5, practical use by the international organization. Then, when we talk about comparative analysis, we must say that every early warning system has an evaluation metrics, because if it's not, how we can evaluate an early warning systems. And the evaluation metrics are four, and are AUROC, that basically measures how effectively a model distinguishes between conflict and non-conflict cases. AUROC means the area in the bottom of the rock curve, and the values above, and they have a value between 0 and 1, and value above 0.9 indicate outstanding precision. AUPR, that is the area in the bottom of PR curve, basically positive rate, evaluates how accurately a model identifies the real outbreaks of violence. Breer score measures basically the gap between predicted probabilities and actual outcomes, and accuracy is simply indicated the percentage of correct predictions overall. And this is indicator from the quantitative backbone of any comparative analysis are crucial for determining which systems are truly reliable. Okay, so let's go inside the topic. I can't mention all the early warning system, but I want to mention two kind of early warning system. One is qualitative and is used by African Union, and one is quantitative, and it's called VIEW, Violence Early Warning System. In fact, among all these systems analyzed, to stand out an opposite methodological approaches. First is the continental early warning system of the African Union, and secondly we have the violence early warning system developed by the Uppsala University. The continental one is a qualitative model integrated into the African peace and security architecture. It relies on regional analysts who interpret indicators, political, economic, social, environmental, to advise decision-making bodies. In this case, the African Unions, and this provides valuable contextual insight, but limits predictive capacity and rapid response. By contrast, violence of early warning system is a quantitative, data-driven, and fully open source model that uses machine learning and dynamic simulation to forecast political violence on a monthly basis, both at national, international, and subnational level. Violence early warning system has been recognized as the most advanced and effective early warning system currently available. Not only because of its outstanding predictive metrics. For example, it has 0.94 of AUROC and Breer score of 0.0006, but also because it combines methodological sophistication with the transparency and in particular operational use. And why? Because firstly, it's open access. It's regularly updated and directly integrated in the United Nations Sahel Predictive Analytic Project, where it has successfully forecast escalated violence in countries such as Nigeria, Ethiopia, and, for example, Mali. For these reasons, violence early warning system is being selected by me as the central reference point of my analysis. It represents the benchmark model, basically, against which all others can be compared. The contrast between violence early warning system and the continental early warning system, that it's basically a war between quantitative and qualitative systems, illustrates its border tension in the field. In fact, quantitative systems provide a precision and replicability, but risk of abstraction. By contrast, qualitative systems grasp local nuances but depend on political will and subjective interpretation. And these are two giant limits inside the scientific literature. The most promising approach, therefore, lies in a hybrid integration where algorithms support and are not replacing expert judgment. And it's a slide that explains how violence early warning system works, and maybe in the Q&A we can go more in details, but let's go to the results. Let's go to experimental part of our research. In fact, this research investigated how international organizations integrate these systems into their preventive frameworks. So then we have analyzed four kinds of international organization, or maybe it's better international institutions. Our analysis is focused on United Nations, European Union, African Union, and NATO. There is no papers in the scientific literature that explain how it's used early warning system inside the international organization. So we had to find basically the official report of every case study of this kind of organization. And after we have seen if inside this kind of case studies, the early warning system, a specific early warning system is used. For example, the United Nations uses a violence early warning system within the Sahel predictive analytics projects, linking predictive analysis to humanitarian planning. That is a case step toward coordinated early action. The European Union uses the global conflict risk index. It's made by the European Union, and use with also this kind of early warning system a data set made by another early warning system that is called the Peoples Under Threat. And this early warning system is officially used by European Union to forecast risk trends 1 to 4 years ahead. That's a very that's an impressive early warning system, guiding resource allocation and preventive diplomacy. By contrast, as I mentioned before, used the continental early warning system that remains vital for mediation, but constrained by political factors that limit operational follow-up. And NATO, that is the most interesting one, doesn't use any kind of early warning system. Basically, when happens something, NATO will try to do some action, but they don't do anything to prevent a potential humanitarian crisis. Independent actors such as Water, Peace and Security Project or the Atrocity Forecasting Project or, for example, the Early Warning Projects have also advanced scientific innovation. Overall, the study confirms that technical precision alone is not enough. An early warning model is effective only when it's embedded with decision-making mechanism capable of transforming alerts into preventive measures. Then, for you, I've done a summary of table that I will share with you if you want with a link. And let's go to the conclusion of our presentation. We can say basically that in conclusion, early warning system for conflict embody the growing intersection between science, policy, and moral responsibility. We understood that they are not just analytical instruments, but frameworks of predictive governance, linking data-driven foresight with diplomatic and humanitarian action. There is one lesson after this research that we have to take, and the lesson from this research is very simple actually, because the prediction has value only when it leads to prevention. So algorithms may calculate the risks, but only institutions and leaders and policy makers can act upon it. The challenge ahead is not to transform early warning into an early response, but eventually into a culture of anticipation. One where foresight replace the reaction, and where preventing violence becomes not only basically a technical goal, but a kind of a moral imperative. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Federico, for a very comprehensive overview of existing early warning systems. So I think that was very useful in setting the stage of the broader topic and the only specific presentation devoted to early warning systems per se. So I'm very happy to leave the floor to Dr. Zahid Shahab Ahmed, Honorary Fellow at the Deakin Institute of Citizenship and Globalization at the Deakin University in Australia, and also, of course, non-resident fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at NUS in Singapore. The presentation will build on peace building and early warning in the case of Pakistan.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Ruth, Rajni, and ISIS, of course. I think it's a very timely event because in South Asia, by this time of the year, we all witness all kinds of natural disasters. Historically, we used to have them because of monsoon rains, but now because of also glacial lake outbursts, floods coming from the mountains, from the Himalayas, and of course, most of the states are not prepared to deal with this. But I believe this framework of polycrises is very interesting because one can see correlations between many of these crises, whether governance crisis, political crisis, environmental and economic, and so on. At the South Asia, of course, well, I think the concept paper for the workshop was very interesting. It was talking about the decline of the international liberal order, but in South Asia, we're witnessing actually the decline of the regional order as well, as China's influence grows because of the Belt and Road Initiative and how India is reacting to it and how smaller South Asian countries are hedging. This has implications also for regional cooperation, and I'll actually focus on all these aspects. First, I think earlier we have talked about the politicization of humanitarian aid and aid in general. We have recently seen how most of that aid, or at least from the US, it was always going towards Israel, but from the West, we see now there's increasing focus on Ukraine and other areas. And eventually, for lower and middle income countries that were aid dependent, now they have to suffer, and they continue to suffer, and they have to be creative, because that's not an excuse that we don't receive the aid and we can just go by it. At the regional level, I talked about the decline of regional order, but also decline of regional cooperation because of India-Pakistan conflict. And many of those challenges that we focus on, or crises, they demand cooperation. For example, the issue of boundary rivers and the river sharing. And we recently saw how this whole issue has been politicized, and the ongoing conflict between India and Pakistan. Another example, I think, relevant for us is that this time around, all the early warnings that came from India, in this case, Pakistan is dependent on India, which is upper riparian, to send the early warnings. And those warnings came through the foreign ministry channels and not through the Indus Water Commission. And of course, a new way of communication was used, and by virtue of that, the warnings were delayed. Now I'm conscious of the time, so I'll focus on what is happening in Pakistan and with reference to peace building and early warning mechanisms. I think first it is important to understand what kind of governance we have in the country. We need to understand the civil military dynamics also. In Pakistan, 70 years or so of existence, at least for 30 years, it was directly ruled by the military. So naturally, there is the dominance of military in various institutions. Often I used to joke that if there is a big accident on a highway, you see that military being called to deal with the crisis. So that's just a small level crisis, a big accident. But when it comes to natural disasters, all the agencies are dominated by the military. Whether serving journals or retired journals, they all are heading those institutions. Whether you call it National Disaster Management Authority, there is also Earthquake Reconstruction and Rehabilitation Authority as well. This naturally creates challenges because civil and military, they both operate differently. At the moment, then, when we talk about this polycrisis phenomena, it's also politically very unstable. We have from one of the largest parties, its leader who's imprisoned. There are always demonstrations going on, whether on economic issues or political issues and so on. So what the government has done, and in any, I think, low or middle income country, they have to prioritize. So in terms of the prioritization, the current regime, which is hybrid regime, so there's no secret about it that Pakistan is identified as hybrid, although I think we need to focus on overall democratic backsliding in South Asia, and I'm sure other speakers will also talk about with reference to the rise of or Generation Z demonstrations and all of that happening in other countries. And I don't think so. I would like to make any predictions about whether this will happen in Pakistan as well or not. But when it comes to the government's priorities, of course, it's the political crisis to begin with, both civil and military leadership. This is what they want to deal with. Then there is the economic crisis, for which they are repeatedly going not back to the World Bank and the IMF, but also to other allies in the oil-rich, Gulf countries, or to China and so on. And then India and Pakistan conflict, the country, like where they both recently had another clash as well. So in terms of the priorities, that has been the focus. And naturally, because I worked in the peace building sector, I observed that the two sectors whether disaster management, climate change, or peace building, all of that, the thinking in Pakistan is that these sectors are dependent on foreign aid. So when foreign aid stops, nothing goes ahead in this. Even when Pakistan, for example, goes and participates in climate change conferences, just like other least developed countries, the point of view is that the rich countries have done the damage and they should, compensate us for this. There is no seriousness, I think, at the domestic level to deal with the issue in a more holistic manner. And now, especially, I think I'll give examples of the peace building sector where I'm deeply engaged in what has happened. And that links to one of the points other speakers made with reference to the lack of transparency and accessibility. When it comes to early warning system, whether to forecast violence or conflicts or natural disasters in Pakistan, we have to look at how civil society or INGOs or international organizations have worked in Pakistan in the last 15 years or so, especially after the Osama bin Laden operation in Abbottabad. And I already talked about the dominance of the military and the securitization of this sector. After that, the authorities started targeting international organizations because it started with blaming the Save the Children for a fake vaccination campaign in Abbottabad, from which the intel was provided about Osama bin Laden's whereabouts. And since then, a lot of NGOs have actually, international NGOs have closed their offices in Pakistan. Every year, actually, a number of them are closing their offices. When it comes to this is the transparency issue on many of the issues. Of course, the government is controlling the information whether it's about the violence related incidents, whether it's about economic crisis. Numbers are manipulated, numbers are either hidden, facts are hidden. And when it comes to now a shrinking space for the civil society, whether the local civil society or the international, they don't have the access. They don't have the access to those regions. Even before the Osama bin Laden operation, access was limited. Most of these aid agencies, the aid was securitized during the war on terror anyways. Most of those projects were operating in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province or in border regions with Afghanistan. That was one reality we dealt with. Another aspect we have seen, since besides securitization on the access issue, when it comes to, for example, now military under the banner of countering terrorism or with reference to insurgency in Balochistan, even local NGOs have no access there. So we cannot talk about international organizations having access. So when it comes to early warning systems, that's why there is nothing happening. There's no early warning coming, and those are just reactionary approaches when incidents happen. Even they have installed all these safe city projects and so on. They did some research on, as part of my project, I did some research on this, and we found that most of those cameras are not even working. Okay, so it comes down to the issue of capacity, I think, in many of these low and middle income countries, because, okay, one thing is to start a project, another thing is to sustain it. And there is disconnection because at the national level, there is lack of coordination because of civil military sort of dynamic in the country. Then I think in terms of the policy also, many of those policy have to be looked at holistically through the lens of, I think, polycrisis. Everything is interconnected. When there are natural disasters, we historically saw how the state was not able to provide any relief there, and extremist organizations had access there. Okay, and many of these extremist organizations were working there. So whether it comes to the National Action Plan for Countering Violent Extremism or National Security Strategy, I think many of these issues have to be looked at through a single lens, so a comprehensive approach can be developed, especially for addressing those. I think early warning mechanisms are very much needed. But again, in Pakistan, the challenge will be of not only accessing those areas, but also of transparency, because especially because of the military's dominance, much of the information is not publicly accessible. Even for the civilian leadership, they also have no idea what is going on in certain areas of the country from where most of these violence-related incidents are reported. When earlier speaker was talking about violence early warning system, I went on its website to look at the data. Okay, they are forecasting in Pakistan these number of violent incidents and so on. But then is the issue of, how accurate those numbers can be when there is lack of access and lack of transparency relating to many of these developments in the country. I'm looking at my clock. It's already 12 minutes or so. I'll stop here out of respect for the hosts and other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zahid, because that was a really exciting presentation and very much premised on also your first-hand experience on this case study. So I found it really interesting. And also thank you for connecting back to the first presentations, the notion of polycrises and the presentation by Federico on early warning. I think that some of the points you mentioned, I hope that they will come back into the discussion, the importance of the transparency when it comes to data, the aspect of access, not just for international organizations, but also for local authorities and local civil society organizations. And we've seen this over and over, even in contemporary conflict. It doesn't matter if it's a military authority or even in the case of civilian authorities. And I'm thinking about the Gaza Strip and the complete lack of access, for example, for not just media organizations, but humanitarian organizations per se. And the kind of complexities that this fosters in terms of then providing for effective humanitarian responses, but also the lack of holistic approach when it comes to polycrisis. And I think that this is also a very key aspect that tends to be underrated by the very specialized humanitarian organizations that deal with crises and only look at thematic areas. It's either economic crisis or natural disasters, or it's a security crisis, and they really struggle to, I worked for 3 years at the World Food Programme, exactly in the early warning unit, and we had different areas of expertise, and we tried to combine as much as possible in a holistic way these aspects of early warnings being triggered by different complexities on the ground, but methodologically remains very complicated, and there's not a standard procedure to do that across the UN. So I think that this is spot on as a comment. I think it's a huge challenge that has still not been worked upon. So I'm happy to give the floor to our next presenter. The case study will be Bangladesh. It's Dr. Asif Shahan, professor at the Department of Development Studies at the University of Dhaka in Bangladesh, but also senior research fellow at the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm just trying to share the PowerPoint. Just give me 1 second. Let me see what's happening here. Oh. For some reason, I'm having some difficulties in sharing this. Okay, if not, I'll move ahead with the.
Okay, I think it's.
Is it? Okay, I think I can. I am having some trouble, but let's move in, and then I'll talk about it. The thing is, and thanks a lot for inviting me. For this, I think this is a really timely event. But I think in case of Bangladesh, I'm telling a related, but kind of a different story. In case of Bangladesh, what we are, going through now is trying to rebuild the political institutions after a 16-year-old authoritarian regime. And I'll talk about a few things. What have we done in the last 1 year, where we are, and I will also kind of, make some judgment about the reforms and the initiatives that we have done to rebuild the institutions, and where we are and why we are here. So the thing is, in Bangladesh, in last year, in August 5, a 16-year-long authoritarian rule finally came to an end through an uprising. So it was a mass uprising, but it was led by the students of the countries, mostly students going to the universities and colleges. It's part of the Gen Z revolution that we are observing throughout the world. So the thing is, if we look into the last 16 years experience, it's interesting to see that the government that eventually transformed into an authoritarian government, it came through a democratic election. It won an election in 2008, and then it decided to change the country's constitution using its brute majority. And to be very honest with you, this has been the story of Bangladesh all along the time. In 1991, when we first made the democratic transition, we had, and since then we had 4 free and fair elections. But every time, in between the elections, the party that was in power tried to manipulate the constitution, make sure that they stay in power, and change the rules of the game. And as part of that, they destroyed the institutions. I'm not just talking about the political institutions. It's not only about the concentration of power at the central level, but it's also about destroying the social institutions, destroying the youth clubs and youth centers that we had in the rural areas, the local government institutions that we had, and politicized them and captured them. And that has been kind of a dominant strategy since 1991. As part of that, the bureaucracy was politicized. As part of that, the different oversight institutions were made inactive. And also as part of that, the armed forces also got involved to some extent. There were some commercial interests that were offered to them. And as a result of that, their loyalty was bought by the political parties. It was kind of, even we had to go through that. There was an attempt to change the constitutions in 1996, which failed. There was another effort in 2006, which also failed. But as I said, that the last government that came into power through an democratic election finally managed to control the constitution. We had a safeguard in our constitution which showed that we will have election held through a caretaker government, an interim government, which will be in power for 90 days just to hold an election. So that was kind of our safeguard, that there will be an alternation of power. And as a result of that, we were kind of become an electoral democracy, not necessarily the liberal democracy or liberal democratic framework. But that too went away in 2011. And that's how the authoritarian government started to run. And over the years, what happened is the authoritarian government really become powerful. So there was their survival became imminent, and at the same time they became resilient. It's kind of they adopted what Garshinsky talked about, the 3 pillars of authoritarianism. There was legitimation, there was the performance legitimacy, and at the same time there were economic growth which was produced, and at the same time the economic growth was used as a justification for undemocratic rule. It was a development versus democracy argument that was presented, and the argument was, as long as you are getting food on your plate, you are getting access to services, you should not bother about democratic rights and others. And to be very honest with you, that strategy actually worked. From BIGD, we tried to measure the perception of the citizens in different years. In 2017, around 70% of the populace was thinking that the country was moving in the right direction economically. But slowly that started to come down. After the COVID, there was a significant economic crisis. And for the first time, we realized that the authoritarian regime became a bit vulnerable, because back then, 37% people were saying that the country was moving in the right direction. So that's a huge jump. From 70%, and in 2018, it was 62%. Then it came down to 37%. So that was probably a first warning to the authoritarian regime that something was not necessarily going right. But eventually what happened, the authoritarian government fell into an authoritarian confidence trap. I would say a confidence trap that things will not necessarily went wrong, because they managed to co-opt the elites. So there was a winning coalition that was built. The business elites were part of that. The armed forces were part of that. The bureaucracy was part of that. And essentially, coercive means and coercive measures were used. There were gross human rights abuses, there was extrajudicial killings which used by the regime, and there were cases of enforced disappearance. So all of those were happening at the same time. But what happened in January 2024, the regime held an election, and no major political parties participated in that election, and they somehow managed to pull it off. After the election was over, India, Russia, China congratulated the PM, and there was kind of USA was critical about that, but did not necessarily deny the legitimacy of the government. So the authoritarian regime was under the impression that everything was under control. And then the uprising started in July 2024. Initially, it was a simple student-led movement about protection to government jobs. It was nothing about democracy. It was nothing about rights or other things. They just wanted, there was a quota reservation within the civil service of Bangladesh, and they just wanted to get rid of it. Probably it would have been in other times, things probably would have gone differently. But after coming through a controversial election, the thing that they have managed to deal with that, the authoritarian government was really, really confident that they would be able to manage it. As a result of that, they did not try to console the students, did not try to have a negotiation with them. They started using repressive measures. And as a result of that, what was essentially a movement for positive liberty transformed into democratic rights. As I said, that citizens' economic conditions were worsening. They also realized that this is the time, and democracy probably is a better option for them, and they joined the students in the movement. So when the movement then transformed into a mass uprising, and within that mass uprising, a clear demand emerged. On August 3, just 2 days before the success of the movement, the students held a huge rally. People from different corners of the life joined that rally, and they demanded not only the end of the authoritarian ruler, they wanted an end to the political system that can give rise to another authoritarian rule. So they wanted a systematic change. They talked about a new social contract. They were talking about building a society which should be more compassionate and accountable. So there was a kind of an aspiration. But at the same time, this was not necessarily a revolutionary aspiration. There was no ideological basis behind that. It was more about governance. It was more about the change in the political structure and other things. And this was the main focus. It was probably what Asif Bayat talked about. It was a revolution. A revolution which aim was to bring about reform within the political system. So that was the goal. So when the last authoritarian government fled, an interim government was put in place, led by Dr. Yunus. And as a result of that, the government had 3 specific goals. They wanted to reform the political system, they want to hold an election, and also they want to ensure justice of the people who died over the 16 years. Now, 1 year after, and now we are waiting for an election. The election timeline has already been declared that there will be election in February. Now we are kind of doing a stock taking, that where we are in terms of those political reforms. Now this is where things gets complicated. The thing is, as I said, that a major goal was looking into the political structure, change in the political structure. So over the time, the government introduced 11 reform commissions, one of them on constitutional change, one of them on electoral system change, one of them on public administration system change. So, and there was a consensus commission was built where they invited the major political parties to participate in the discussion and come up with a charter which will outline the issues of agreement. And 166 recommendations were initially identified from those commission reports. And finally, they came up with the 84 proposals, which they identified as July Charter. This is something that is coming out of the movement. But the problem is, the major political parties who participated in the process, they did not agree on the different aspects of the political structural changes. For instance, the commission argued in favor of an upper chamber, to have an upper chamber, whose main role will be, because in case of Bangladesh, most of the problems started in arbitrary change in the constitution. And the arbitrary change in the constitution worked because in the lower house, due to the first past the post, people have a tendency to vote on anger, which allowed two consecutive governments to have absolute majority, and which they used to change the constitution. So learning from the experiences, they wanted to introduce an upper chamber where the members will be elected through peer, through proportional representation, so that there can be some kind of check in arbitrary constitutional changes. They wanted to also make sure that the independence of the oversight institutions can be ensured, so that anti-corruption commissions and the Human Rights Commission, the other institutions, they can be remain free from the executive, and executive doesn't necessarily control their appointment process. The thing is, in all of those proposals, the major political party, Bangladesh Nationalist Party, which everyone expecting will come into power, they did not agree. They have a note of dissent on that. They did not agree on the independent because they are thinking that since we are coming into power, we do not necessarily want any check on the executive power. That's the argument that they made, and that they said that this will weaken the government. The government will not necessarily be able to perform. And as a result of that, right now we are unsure that whether we will have specific reforms. They agreed to two things. One is term limit of the prime minister, that the prime minister will not be elected for more than 2 times. They agreed on the appointment of the election commission, but in many cases, even those things have serious flaws. So to be very honest with you, if you consider where we are right now, and if we have an election in February, it is very unlikely that we will have a meaningful reform. We will not probably see that. The best we can see is move back to a vulnerable electoral democracy of the 1991, which can lead to another uprising. We may are facing with that. There's no change in administrative structure. And what happened during this period, there has been a rise of mobocracy. So the government could not necessarily, the interim government largely failed in maintaining the law and order. And as a result of that, we have seen the different groups, including the right-wing groups, the radical groups, they came up with different demands. And the government, instead of actually addressing them or dealing with them, sometimes they gave up to them, they gave away to them, they listened to them. There were incidents where the shrines were destroyed in different parts of Bangladesh. Nothing has been done. There are incidents where those kind of things were happening, and there has not been any action. So what happened? And this is where I will come to. The one thing that happened, if you look into the reform process, the entire reform process was elite-driven. Even though we are talking about a mass uprising, within this process, when we have gone through a commission-driven reform system, there was not necessarily any opportunity for the citizens to participate in the process. There was some survey that was done by the government agencies, but the inputs from the surveys were not necessarily being incorporated. And now we are talking about a referendum to approve the July Charter. But the funny thing is, the referendum is being initiated by the political elites. The questions will be framed by the political elites, and there has not been any effort to let people know that what has been included within the July Charter. It's like we are asking people to vote on a charter without telling them what will happen if the charter is being implemented. So essentially, it has remained an elite-driven process. At the same time, what happened is the civil society organizations that we had in the past, they went through a shrinking space challenges over the last 15 years, and a lot of them decided to cut a deal with the then authoritarian government. They transformed their ways of working. They did not necessarily talk about human rights violation. And as a result of that, those civil society organizations are now being criticized. There is not effective representation of civil society organization in Bangladesh because the sons of the uprisings, they are considering those civil society organizations as kind of a delegitimized actor. So there is no strong civil society. There is no citizens' voice. And at the same time, what happened is when the mobocracy, as I said, that the law and order situation was declining, where the rise of the right-wing forces are being becoming a phenomena, the remaining political elites who are still controlling the power and led the reform process, they're getting very, very concerned about radical changes. So they're getting concerned that if we allow participation, we allow those things to happen, that will actually create a more problem into that. So there is a resistance to change, which is coming from the inside, from the BNP, as I talked about, the political leaders, and also within the bureaucracy. Just to give one example that, for the public administration, there were many reform proposals were suggested. The one they're implementing is having washrooms in every petrol pumps. So that is the reform that they are going through, instead of looking to the structural changes, accountabilities, and others. And the other thing happened is the students who participated in the uprising, they decided to form a political party, and they eventually participated, instead of going out to the citizens, telling them what the reform is all about, what they want to achieve. They eventually decided to participate in the political bargaining process, which is essentially an asymmetric political bargain, where the traditional political elites are having all of those powers. So as a result of this elite-driven process, the lack of participation of the citizens, the miscalculation of the student-led political parties, the Gen Z political parties, and the political elites becoming concerned about the changes, all of those are creating the problems in the reform process. So and I think we are going through an historical vicious circle. In the past, whenever we faced a crisis, we quickly try to come up with a solution without the consequences that will happen. We are following the same rule. We are not necessarily considering the consequences. We are again focusing on elite bargain and elite agreement, what they think is the right way to, and this hasn't changed. So as the country is waiting for a national election, faith in change is waning, and it is likely that the mass and the critical institutions are waiting for a return to the status quo of the 90s. We are not necessarily moving forward. So this is kind of the things we are happening. So I'll end here, and I'm happy to talk about the reforms and experiences in detail if there are any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asif. That was a very comprehensive kind of overview of the last few years in Bangladesh and the uprisings and the, as you call it, the vicious circle and cycle of these uprisings and reform attempts and their failure. I'm happy to give the floor to Rajni for our last presentation, which really circles back as to our starting point, which is Sri Lanka. And looking not at the early warning per se in this case, but more, again, the protest side and the political instability dimension in Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Rose. Yeah, I think it was very insightful to follow my presentation after the first four, because I think the early warning system, and I'll kind of try to reflect on this as I speak through my 10 minutes or so, which is that the early warning system kind of provides a framework for me to think in terms of how you have these crises and polycrises that unfold, such as in Sri Lanka, and what the capacity of the state and the institutions are in responding to that crisis. And then, of course, I found Sahid's and Asif's presentations really useful, because on the one hand, there's a lot of recurrence or repetition, that a lot of familiarity with the Sri Lankan context when they describe Pakistan and Bangladesh. So I hope I can kind of point to those linkages as I present on the Sri Lankan case. I'll be sharing some slides. Yes. Yeah, so because Andrea also, I think, gave a very kind of useful analysis of this, of the Sri Lankan context, but from a more detailed perspective, I thought I will approach this from a slightly more, let's say, theoretical or concept-based approach. And like I said before, a lot of it will repeat, especially with what Asif was saying, which is that when we enter the question of the role of institutions or the capacity of institutions, the capacity and the legitimacy of states, and how they respond to crisis, and then how we can anticipate or preempt that crisis. It is not something very radical to say that from the vantage point of a global south, former colony such as Sri Lanka, that the process of state formation, especially after independence, has been a process very much of crisis. So the state has been in a state of constant crisis, and we have seen cycles of that. And in 2022, we were just seeing another iteration of that. And so when we look at it from the standpoint of state formation, where the state is seen as something that is, the state and its institutions are seen as something that is not a static entity, but as something that is constantly in the process of being formed through contestation among various social groups, then we see that the Sri Lankan state has been in a process of constant crisis. And in the Sri Lankan case, most visibly manifested in the civil war that we had for 30 years, but also the other forms of political violence we saw during that period and even in the aftermath of the war. And in the context of Sri Lanka specifically, this took the form of legitimizing the state specifically taking on the agenda of an ethnocratic state, so of majoritarianism, where both institutions and the society were kind of reorganized along an ethnic category. So the question really is when it is the states and when it is the institutions within the state that trigger crisis, how do we kind of speak about preventing crisis through these institutions or through better coordination or better functioning of these institutions? So that was the first kind of question I wanted to front. And then the second point, which I think Asif was really describing very well, which is that the institutions, especially as states enter this crisis, and as the crisis deepens, the institutions also become very deeply contested areas. And I think in Andreas's kind of presentation, we see this contestation really being heightened in terms of what kind of feedback states respond to and act on, and so on. And seeing institutions as these sites of contestation, which intensify when crises break out, is useful because this is also where the kind of play out of resistance emerges. So as we know, usually states and institution building are shaped by social conflict over resource allocation and who has authority to make those decisions. And these contestations are also not equal. So even though much of the state building and policy formation processes are captured by certain elite interests, we do know that within these spaces of the institutions, whether they are formal institutions or even outside the formal political space, that these are contested by groups that are often have less access to these resources and so on. So it's a constant process of formation, of resistance, of contestation. And this is kind of useful because when we see these institutions as sites of social struggle, then we also do not see crisis as necessarily something that is negative, but it is rather kind of this articulation of demand for more rights and more equity and so on. And the third point that I wanted to make before I move on to the 2022 people's protests, which is that especially after the 1980s. So we have the liberal international order that starts to gain dominance after the post-World War II era. But especially after the 1980s, we see that the US-led liberal democratic order starts to have a lot of influence even in the Sri Lankan context under a very pro-US government at the time. And what this also does is that it mainstreams this idea of securing institutions and of refining institutions, and as that being the key solution to prevent crisis folding out. So we have this mainstreaming idea of institutions first. And in the 1980s onwards, we see the dominant definitions of political violence taking two dominant forms, and one of them is that saying that the political violence that we see is a result of the hollowing out of institutions that were meant to prevent this kind of political violence, but it's because these institutions are not keeping up to their ideal benchmark or ideal performance. This is why crises break out. And the second kind of narrative that comes out during this time is that a lot of the violence is taking place in extra-institutional forms. So this idea of extra-institutional violence also takes form during this time. And this kind of understanding really persists in Sri Lanka over the next 2 to 3 decades. We saw in the 2015 elections which brought the Yahapalna government into power were again the main promises of the government and the main demands of the people who elected in the government were largely in terms of refining our democratic institutions. So that could look in terms of constraining the executive office, in terms of pursuing constitutional reforms, in terms of establishing reconciliation institutions in the aftermath of the aftermath of the war, and in strengthening accountability. So in short, a continued emphasis on strengthening institutions has pervaded all the way up to the 2022 crisis. So this brings me to the 2022 crisis, and really the question that I think we are asking in Sri Lanka, but also perhaps in Bangladesh and Nepal, is whether this demand for liberal democratic institutions or of institutions of some form that deliver on the expectations of the various groups of people within a society, whether this demand has fundamentally changed, because during moments of crisis, we see that there's a moment of rupture and some of these prevailing understandings of the importance of institutions sometimes get questioned. But as Asif says, and in the Sri Lankan context as well, what we are seeing is that what is articulated as system change, while in the moment of crisis, it gets articulated in forms that are even beyond reinforcing the democratic institutions, eventually they get distilled and co-opted to mean the kind of the past attempts at making institutions more accountable and responsive to preventing authoritarian excesses. So within the protests, just very quickly, I will talk about how the dominant articulation of system change, which was a slogan that we saw within the Sri Lankan protests. There were many articulations, but really the dominant articulations at that time kind of grouped around the agenda of anti-corruption and also of economic rights. And this was expected because, like I said, because of this history and demand of historical demand for good governance, especially since 2015, but also because of the intensity of the economic crisis, which made the call for economic rights and welfare much more pronounced. But the question that I wanted to ask is that within the people's protests, within the Aragalaya, was the idea or the concept of institutions and institutional capacity, was there something new that was introduced at the time? Were they challenging the existing institutions? And what we see are two kind of dominant strands within the Aragalaya, and they're not exclusive to one another. They often overlap. The first articulation was that the current institutions within Sri Lanka are not delivering, or they're not able to meet the expectations of the groups that are not the elite. And what they were advocating for was for alternative arrangements that are outside the established democratic system. And this took the form of the idea of people's councils, so these deliberative forums that are outside the formal state system, that would then kind of group up together to form this national council. So this was one imagination of institutions that could absorb and give a space for people's needs outside of the formal state system. And then the second strand of thinking was that we need to also reform the existing state system from within. So demands for more articulation, more accountability, and all of that. So you could see both these strands of thoughts. What was interesting was that the 2022 government under Wickremesinghe at that time really co-opted these aspirations or these concepts at the time. So in terms of establishing extra state institutions that could absorb that could make people feel heard and responded to, the idea of the people's councils and the national councils were replicated within the government, initiated under this concept called the Janasabha, as well as a national council. But of course, now looking back, we see that not much was done on these grounds beyond the initiation of these. And then in terms of the second strand, which was of the institutions being refined from within under the Wickremesinghe government, we saw efforts at incorporating more youth to the parliamentary sectoral oversight committees. But these kind of co-opting these desires within the Aragalaya were not sufficient. As we know, the structural issues were not addressed. The government was very unpopular, and the NPP rose to power as an extension, perhaps, of the Aragale's demand for improving the institutions and making them more responsive from within rather than without. And under the NPP government, when we look at whether institutions are now more capable of preventing crisis as well as responding to popular frustrations. It's a difficult question to answer because we are still in the first year of the government. But what appears to be the case, just give me 1 second because I've lost my train of thought, is that we see that anti-corruption has been placed at the center of the public discourse or the center of the government discourse, whereas ethno-religious concerns, such as questions of power decentralization, have been sidelined and reframed as economic issues. So on the one hand, while nationalism being kind of sidelined is a good thing, we also seen that the concerns or that underlie the major fault line of Sri Lankan politics, which is of majority-minority relations, they are being sidelined while economic issues or anti-corruption issues are being prioritized. And this is important because at the same time, this anti-corruption agenda also assumes the form of representing the haves and the have-nots. And it is framed as the solution of the extreme economic inequalities and the poverty in the country, and prevents the government or kind of excuses the government from making any deeper structural reforms. And what we see is that a financial logic dominates the state's reasoning, which further entrenches local and international capital under the government, which also legitimizes a strongman state. So this greater centralization of the state that is evident not only in this promise of an anti-corruption dividend, but also in other initiatives that fall within this larger umbrella of Clean Sri Lanka, which is such as anti-drug campaigns. So I will kind of end my presentation with just one last comment, which is that relating to this point on whether institutions are able to preempt and prevent crisis, I think a very quick answer from my side would be no. And here I echo the concerns that Zahid and Asif were saying as to why this is the case in terms of access, in terms of transparency, and highlighting that in the current context, when the anti-corruption discourse kind of dominates and even sidelines certain identity issues, there is the danger that the resurfacing of these identity issues might not be anticipated in time. So that is one. The second point I wanted to mention was that popularity or populism, the government responding very quickly to the needs of the citizen, does not necessarily translate into inclusion. So again, institutions, as power is centralized, we are seeing that institutions are not necessarily improved in terms of absorbing or responding to citizens' frustrations. And then the last point that I wanted to make was that in terms of anticipating crisis and so on, we also have to keep an eye on the changing demographics. We are in a society that is increasingly atomized, and a new generation of youth are making electoral decisions, as we saw in the last election cycle. And they're also having different ideological orientations, because in Sri Lanka, we are in a post-war context. Neoliberal development is taking hold more deeply. So the ideological orientations are different. The development aspirations are also very quick cycles. So they need kind of quick delivery of certain material aspirations. And in this context, the kind of crises that take form might be different from the previously anticipated crisis. And responding to these would need institutions that are much more short-term, which are able to absorb public feedback faster than the existing institutions such as elections. So, okay, I'm going to stop here. I know I spoke a lot, and I hope we can have a fruitful discussion.
So first of all, thank you so much, Rajni. I think your presentation was really complementary to a number of the aspects we mentioned across different case studies, but also Sri Lanka. And some of the points you raised at the end in terms of takeaways and suggestions for how to deal with protest uprisings, rage and demands, I think that they could be applied to a number of democratic countries across Europe as well now. and the lack of enthusiasm towards forms of procedural democracy increasingly manifest across our political systems. Okay, so I'm happy to wrap up here when it comes to our presentations. We do have a few minutes if we want for, of course, discussion and feedbacks and comments. Then I would say, because we've been running a little bit late, but I think we can keep maybe 10-15 minutes for discussion and Q&A. Or just things that we want to comment on because we found them interesting, or they overlap with what we're working on, or they gave us further food for thought. So as far as I'm concerned, I think that there's a lot to be said about also first of all, the interlinkages between and I think that these came up in a couple of presentations, early warning, not just as a technical issue, but part of broader kind of governance schemes and their failures as also a failure of governance, both at the international, regional and domestic levels. And the other way around, when early warning works, then a number of questions arise. So if early warnings are actually made public, then it's much more easy to see if early action is not undertaken. And so it's a different kind of failure of governance. And it's important to distinguish the two. So maybe that's a first point, to kind of also not just deal with early warning as just a technical issue, a depoliticized issue, but part of a broader kind of political agenda for effective governance. A second point that I think came up in a number of presentations is the notion of polycrises, because it seems to capture a lot of what is happening and undergoing in a number of our of the current crises that we're looking at, and that will increasingly be the case, of course, with in the era of Anthropocene, but also in an era where economics and politics are so intertwined. And so what does this mean in terms of effective governance on a number of levels? So are our institutions able to capture the complexities of these increasing interrelations and intertwining of different aspects of our political and economic and climate lives? Are early warning systems able to capture this interconnectedness? Are the people that work across public administrations trained enough or trained in the right way to understand these complexities and detect polycrises before they erupt? And maybe the third point I want to mention, just as a takeaway, is the era of transformation. So we started from reflecting on what does it mean to think about humanitarianism in a post-liberal international order, in a post-liberal way. And this is something that I'm looking at as we speak. So are there alternative models of humanitarianism? And I think that some of you mentioned the need for a number of countries, such as Pakistan, to start relying more on their own self-resources when it comes also to aid. But this doesn't apply to Pakistan alone. I'm thinking about countries in the Middle East, which is my area of expertise, such as Jordan, that are increasingly struggling, of course, in an age of declining financial resources and political will dedicated to foreign aid, to foreign assistance, not just democratic, but also humanitarian and development. So what does that mean in terms of sense of ownership, if you want, in a way, to becoming more self-reliant? So it can be also a new narrative for countries across the global south and beyond, not to be less and less dependent on Western aid. But then, of course, it leaves a number of vacuums that can be filled by other actors. And it was mentioned the very interesting example of non-state armed groups at the local level that can access areas where civil society organizations cannot access, or even government forces cannot access. And I'm thinking about a number of other examples. For example, now in the war in Sudan, this is also the case in a number of contexts that are under siege, and only non-state armed groups can access those places. But also, of course, it leaves a vacuum open for other non-Western, non-liberal international actors to politicize aid if they want to, be it Russia, be it others, for some forms of conditionality, which won't be democratic conditionality as we knew it in the past, or good governance conditionality, but other forms, votes in the UN, for example, or permits to build new infrastructures, or a number of cases. So what does that tell us in terms of also reshaping of the international order through the lenses of aid and new forms of humanitarianism? So I'll open the floor for 10-15 minutes discussion or comments from whoever. And since I think we are a small crowd, you can just jump in and open your mic.
Yes, and I also wanted to say, because this is a webinar, the attendees would have to ask their questions through the Q&A. And yes, then we can ask the questions. Okay, if I can maybe get started with a question, or rather maybe even a comment, which I found really interested in Dr. Sahid's presentation, speaking about how there are these anti-US sentiments and surrounding the aid cuts, but also because even in Sri Lanka, we have for a long time had these anti-US or anti-Western sentiments surrounding the civil war, for example, and how this then makes the role of institutions, or in terms of access of data, of transparency and so on, that affects that. And I was wondering, especially with this recent round of aid cuts, how much that impacts the legitimacy of international organizations in terms of the data they collect for early warning systems. Yes, so that was kind of a question or comment that I had.
We all go ahead. I was also reflecting on something which I missed while presenting, because I was rushing through my notes in my earlier 10 to 12 minutes or so. I think it's a serious legitimacy crisis issue that also directly, indirectly affected whatever we have talked about, the polycrisis, especially with reference to South Asian countries, regimes that lack legitimacy, and how they are trying to, either control the flow of data or the information. So we are witnessing this lack of transparency and access issues all across, and how all of that compounds into examples of repression we talked about, or bad governance, for example, and ultimately, like everything boils down not only to, just a few examples of not having early warning mechanisms, but overall the level of good governance, and the level of public policy decision making in all these countries. Because when these regimes lack legitimacy, what they are doing is, number one, on their list of agendas is actually to do whatever for their own survival. So that's what they're thinking to begin with whenever they are discussing anything, and everything else becomes secondary. Unfortunately, that's what we are witnessing in a number of countries.
Dr. Asif, I think you have a question in the Q&A. If you want, I can read it.
No, yeah, I got that. Just yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, the concern is really real, and I think this has been a proper method of, there has been a long discussion on this, because during the July uprising, so there were a lot of women, I mean, women from different corners and different religious views, they participated in the uprising, and they had a very important role, throughout the process. But what happened after that, as you have rightly pointed out, that we did not see them. In fact, if you see as I was talking about the consensus commission, meetings and others where the political parties participated, there were different photographs that were circulated within the social media. There are more than 100 or close to 100 representatives in the consensus commission, but the total number of women were only one. There was just one woman was talking about the, and as we are talking about the political changes and others, there was no representation of women. So I think it you're talking about the interim government, and the interim government could have done a lot of things. First of all, when they are having a discussion with the political parties and others, they did not necessarily emphasize on the representation of women. When they're sending their delegates to the consensus commission, when they're sending their delegates to have a discussion with the interim government to think about that, they did not do that. More importantly, even when they were setting up their reform commissions, I talked about the 11 reform commissions. In many reform commissions, there were no women. And in most of the reform commissions, their representation is absolutely tokenistic. Just one women were included, and not necessarily thinking about their specific roles and responsibilities. And the Women's Reform Commission is the only commission and where there were all the members are women. It's like that, since it's a women's issue, we need more women on that, and women don't necessarily need to think about the other things. So there is kind of that particular perspective that has been held by the interim government. That's one thing. The second thing is, when there were several attacks, cyberbullying, and other issues, and other movements were happening against women's security and safety, the interim government did not necessarily take a decisive step. So at one end, at the societal level, they did not send a signal. On the other hand, in political discussions and deliberation, they did not necessarily ensure the representation of women. So if you think what could have the interim government done, I think those are the issues that they really should focus on, should have focused
on. I got a question from within the chat, which is addressed to Federico, which is asking, can he elaborate upon the differences between continental EWS and violence EWS, and specify what he means by violence EWS causing obstructions in results?
Sorry, do you hear me? And I had a technical issue. Can you repeat the?
All right. It says, can he elaborate upon the differences between continental EWS and violence EWS, and specify what he means by violence EWS causing obstructions in results?
Yes, basically the CEWS is the early warning system used by the African Union. So it's important because it's an early warning system used by an international organization, and but the most important thing is that it's a qualitative early warning system, and this is the main difference between these two early warning systems. The African Union ones, so basically the CEWS, the Continental Early Warning Systems, uses the experts analysis. Okay, so then we have diplomatic relations by these kind of experts, and we have a lot of other relations that I can share with you if you want. With my research in particular, but the most important thing is that the African Union continental early warning systems has a bias. And that bias, that limit, is basically the political will of the national governments of the African continent. Cause yes, firstly, we don't have actually a real algorithm that is reliable and replicate the analysis of the expert. And secondly, the governments, the national governments of African Union use the early warnings for their aims, basically, sometimes, and that's very ineffective. In fact, we have demonstrated, we have proved that the early warning system used by the African Union is less effective than the views. The views, the violence early warning system, use
a formula that it's very interesting. I have shared the formula before, and the most important thing of this kind of early warning system is the fact that replicate the algorithm 6 months. So basically, the early warning systems, the violence early warning system formula is like that. They try to calculate the absolute percentage, the probability of a potential violent risk area. And is calculated as it's equal as the sum of all the machine learning, no, it is the sum of all the relative percentage of all of a specific area divided by all the algorithm model inside the early warning system formula. Then, if we want to make a comparison, obviously the violence early warning system is more effective, but only because it replicates its algorithm. And the early warning system used by the African Union, it is not. But it's more easy to interpret. So if we want to give a point for the African Union early warning system, we can say that it's more easy to interpret because we have expert analysis, so it's more interpretable by the policymaker. But policymaker are influenced by politics itself. And if we want to stay in the technical topic, we can say that the violence early warning system is more effective.
I think you're muted, Ruth. There is one question, Dr. Shahan, that is addressed towards you.
Sure. I think the question is about the oversight institutions. When the Constitutional Reform Commission was, preparing its proposals, they actually proposed for a National Constitutional Council, following the model of Sri Lanka and Nepal, which the major political parties rejected. And at the same time, then there were in the July Charter that we finally came up with, there is a provision for having the selection process of the oversight institutions, including Anti-Corruption Commission, Election Commission, Human Rights Commission, and others through a multi-party committee. But the problem is the major political party has not necessarily agreed to that. In the context of Bangladesh, their argument is this will weaken the executive, this will weaken the government. The counter argument that has been presented by the civil society groups, academics, and others, that these are not necessarily executive institutions, these are oversight institutions, and their main responsibilities are to hold the executive accountable. So if the executive control the appointment of those institutions, it doesn't mean anything. So there will not be any accountability. So eventually we are at an impasse because the July Charter included that provision, but the political party which we are expecting to come into power, they say they're not necessarily agree with this proposal. There is a sentiment there. There was a demand there from the other political parties, but let's see. It's still not clear that whether this will be eventually implemented.
I think Andrea and Federico, there are two questions.
Yeah. So I can answer to those questions. I will talk about the specific Sri Lankan case, and I can also say something in general about interagency and interinstitutional coordination. So the issue is not really that all the different agencies are using different indexes, but especially, actually, let me start from a different perspective. So there is a interagency, interinstitutional coordination when it comes to early warning. And this happens mostly at the top level. So for example, there are schedule meetings between the different UN agencies where they share their expertise, and if some specific agency has issued a warning, is issuing a warning about a specific country, is going to share that with the other agencies. It is the interagency standing committee meetings, and this happens at every, if I'm not wrong now, it's happening every 3 months. And so this is a way for the different agencies to share the findings about specific countries. The issue, though, is that this happens at the top level. But when it comes to the data that is being collected within specific countries, then the problem is that really it depends on the country. So in some country, there is a coordination between the international organization staff that is working in that country. In other countries, there is not much coordination. So it really depends more on the specific situation of the specific country, right? So there isn't really a system for this coordination at the bottom level. And that's one issue. The second issue that emerged from the Sri Lankan case is that in order to have that coordination, first of all, you need to have data to share. And in the case of Sri Lanka, I found that the issue was exactly that so the different organizations that were working on Sri Lanka, in Sri Lanka, they didn't even see the data that they had. They didn't read the data that they had as signs of a crisis. So in that sense, they couldn't share anything because they didn't look at the data they had as something meaningful in a sense. And that also, so just to clarify on the study, because I feel that that was lost in the few minutes that I had there. So the issue is that, for example, just to clarify, so the issue is that, for example, the European Union was looking at Sri Lanka only. They were looking at human rights data. They were looking at the risk of conflict. So they were looking at Sri Lanka from the lens of conflict prevention. So that's the kind of information they were looking for. World Food Program, it was looking at food production data, but they were looking at it more from the point of view of, like natural disasters. So they were worried with flooding and landslides in those months, and at the same time, so that's the kind of data they were looking at. And in this sense, so there wasn't really a kind of data sharing or coordination because neither organization was interested in the kind of data that the other organizations were looking at. Yeah, I hope I answered.
I think the final question is for our colleagues from Naples, if anyone wants to take that one. How much do differences in the transatlantic relationship affect EU policy on development, humanitarian aid, and conflict prevention or peace building, especially when it comes to support for NGOs?
Yes. And thanks for the question, Ivan. And do you hear me? Yes. The transatlantic relationship continues to basically shape the European Union external policies, but its influence has become increasingly fragmented in the post-liberal international order. And let's do an historical framework. Historically, in fact, the EU and the United States shared a normative framework centered on liberal humanitarianism, and they both promoting democracy, human rights, and multilateral cooperation. However, recent years have seen a progressive divergence. In fact, US aid and development strategies, particularly after Trump administration, have shifted toward the national interest and geopolitical competition, while EU has still tried to maintain a rules-based and multilateral approach based basically on the rule of law. This kind of divergence has a significant implication for humanitarian action and NGOs engagement, in particular in South Asia. The US approach, the EU European Union approach emphasized local ownership, civil society participation, long-term resilience, in contrast to the US that focused themselves on a state-centered stabilization and security objective. As a result, the EU increasingly seeks to a project kind of a strategic autonomy, preserving humanitarian identity while acknowledging the need for a pragmatic alignment with the transatlantic partners. Then the erosion of transatlantic consensus also weakens coordination in crisis prevention, especially in complex context. And what kind of complex context are we talking about? We are talking about like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, where overlapping political, climatic, and social vulnerabilities require coherent strategies, no? In summary, the European Union's humanitarian and development policies in South Asia still operate within the transatlantic framework, but they now represent a distinctive and more autonomous European vision, one that blends normative principles with adaptive pragmatism in a rapidly changing global order, basically. So yes, kind of difficult relationship, but yeah, that's my answer.
Professor Ruth, I think we are ending these sessions. If you have any final comments as the chair.
So I'd like to thank all our participants and speakers. I think it was maybe just the start of a broader conversation. It would be great if we could devise other forms and ways of taking this forward, either thematically with different case studies or same case studies, but in a more maybe holistic approach, because it was, at least for me, a lot of food for thought and very challenging and inspiring talks. I leave the floor to you in terms of next steps, especially when it comes to publications. I would like to thank everybody also for making yourself available and for finding this opportunity also with the web seminar. Of course, it's always nicer to see each other in person. So this is also my hope that next time that we do something together, it's either in Singapore or in Naples, also according to the weather, and that we make it also a nice kind of social experience and not just an academic exchange. But over to you, Rajni, and thanks everyone.
Thank you. And yes, so in terms of, we were hoping for a written output of this in terms of the conversations we've been having. And like I said before, clearly we can see this, at least I see the conversation on the early warning systems, and then the dynamics that we were discussing in the South Asian context. The two seem to complement each other. So it'll be interesting to bring that out. We're planning to as a special report from a joint special report. So we'll be kind of sharing those with the speakers as well. And thank you again to Ruth and Andrea who were very much part of organizing this webinar, and to the speakers and to the audience as well. And on that note, I'll like to bring the webinar to a close and wish everyone a good weekend ahead. Thank you.